while ago, John Windsor gave us some teaching on dispensationalism, and very helpful. And after that, someone asked me some reference was made to covenant theology, and one of you asked me, what is covenant theology? And so I thought, well, something does need to be said on that. And then as we began to think about it, one thing led to another, and that ended up with what you have in your hand. And so I mean, it just has become clear to me over really the past year or 2 years that we're not talking about two positions here, but actually three. And that commonly, it's thought that on the one hand you have dispensationalism, and on the other, covenant theology. That those are the two options. I mean, that is pretty common in the minds of Christians. But actually there's a third position. And I could diagram it maybe this way. Conrad Burroughs called and confirmed the dates, June 20 to 22. Here's dispensationalism with 7 dispensations, and here on the other extreme is covenant theology. Here in the middle is what could be called New Covenant theology. In this first paragraph here on this outline, you could, I forgot to correct it. The common idea with regard to the history or the philosophy or the plan of redemption, you can cross off the word it, and then cross off the words commonly thought. So it should read, the common idea with regard to the history or the philosophy or the plan of redemption is that there are two basic positions, covenant theology on the one hand and dispensationalism on the other. And just as a bit of a review, I put some things down here on dispensational theology. Its rise to popularity, it was taught in some forms down through the church age, but was really popularized and crystallized by John Darby in the 1800s of the Plymouth Brethren. Don't feel you have to look up at me and just follow your outline. This is kind of a teaching. I hope it won't be just nuts and bolts and dry bones. But especially it was popularized in the 1900s by the Scofield Reference Bible, which interestingly was the first publication of the Oxford University Press of New York to attain a sale of 1 million copies. That's how popular that Scofield Reference Bible was and is. Dallas Theological Seminary is the main stronghold and springboard of dispensationalism today. Charles Ryrie's book, Dispensationalism Today, has popularized it also. This word, as John pointed out, this word dispensationalism comes from, what they take it from is from the Greek word economia, from which we get the word economy, which means household management, household law, household rule. And if you take an economics course, it's how the wife is supposed to learn anyway. The woman is supposed to learn how, as a wife, she is to manage the household, rule the household, set up the household. And so, in other words, when they're talking about dispensationalism, they're talking about how God manages, rules, runs the world. And the idea is that God dealt with mankind down through the history of the human race by means of various covenants, various dispensations, various economies, various agreements, arrangements. You see, all those words are synonymous. and that in each one of those dispensations, God had a way of dealing with those people, and he gave a revelation to those people and a responsibility for them based on that revelation. And that there was a judgment upon them for failing that responsibility of that revelation. And those 7 dispensations are the dispensation of innocence to the fall, and then conscience from the fall to the flood, human government from the flood to Abraham, promise from Abraham to Moses, law from Moses to Christ, grace from the first to the second coming. They make statements like Christendom failed, and even believers fail. So even if there was failure in this age of grace, this dispensation of grace, each age there was failure. So God brought in this next dispensation, you see. And then the last one is the millennium, from the second coming to Satan's release. And even that, is based on their hermeneutics. I wouldn't agree with that myself. Errors of dispensationalism: it chops up the Bible too much. For example, they make statements like that there's 2 different gospels. Jesus preached one gospel up to Matthew 16:21 and then preached a different gospel. From that time, Jesus Christ began to show his disciples that he must go to the cross and so on. So they say that began a different gospel, Matthew 16:21. Different gospels. It teaches different methods of salvation. Dispensationalists, you'll hear them say that the believers, the saints in the Old Testament, were not regenerate. Now here the New Testament holds them up as examples of holiness. Here we are regenerate with Christ within, and they're saying that we should look back to those unregenerate believers as examples of holiness. It doesn't make a bit of sense, does it? Also, at poor hermeneutics. The emphasis is on a futurist interpretation. In other words, that a lot of the scriptures which I would hold have been fulfilled, they say are still in the future, and also a literalist interpretation. Of course, there are some who were supposed to take it literally, some obviously figuratively. Again, as E.J. Young said, the main rule in hermeneutics is not future or fulfilled, not this or that, but honesty. That's the main rule. Examples: David's son enthroned. 2 Samuel 7:13, I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever, and that is taken by them to refer to something yet future. Whereas Peter, in the Pentecost sermon in Acts chapter 2, teaches it was fulfilled right there at the resurrection and the ascension of Christ, being seated at the right hand of God. It says, and so David, he was a prophet, and he knew that God had sworn to him with an oath to seat one of his descendants upon his throne. He looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection. So he's saying, you Jews, look, this has been fulfilled. The ascension of Christ, the session of Christ at the right hand of God, this is a fulfillment of what David was talking about back there in 2 Samuel 7. Whereas they say, it's something yet future. Christ is going to set up a throne over there in Jerusalem, literally, and so on. Also, for another example, the blessing to Abraham. In you, all families of the earth shall be blessed. This passage has both literal and spiritual application. And there was literal blessing through him, but also spiritual blessing implied there, as we can see in Acts 3:26 and Galatians 3:8, where it refers to that blessing of Abraham. But here you see in Galatians 3:8, it takes it with reference to the gospel. It specifically says in 3:8 of Galatians, and the scripture foreseeing that God would justification, the heathen through faith preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, In you shall all the nations be blessed. So what was that blessing? What was that blessing? It was the blessing of being turned from our iniquities, Acts 3:26. That's what that blessing was. When God told Abraham, in you and in your seed will all the nations be blessed, what seed was he talking about? He's talking about Christ. What was the blessing he was talking about? He was talking about the gospel, justification, being turned from sin. The gospel goes out into all the nations. The Gentiles will be brought in, you see. And out of all these nations, the elect Gentiles would be blessed. They would be turned from their sins, saved from their sins. Whereas they take it as something literal, pertaining to the Jews, pertaining to the Palestine, and so on. Another example, the perpetual covenant promises for Abraham's children. They emphasize that land of Palestine. They emphasize the Jewish nation. And Romans 11, they take that in a physical sense, whereas what is it talking about? It's talking about vessels of mercy. It's talking about salvation. He's talking about the elect ethnic Jews. The elect of those ethnic Jews, the elect being saved. And so in that sense, the calling of God and the gifts of God are irrevocable. In other words, the elect out of the Jews, the elect, they are the ones that are going to be saved. See, God hasn't taken his favor away from the Jews. He is still saving Jews, and he is bringing them into the kingdom, just like the Gentiles. But the dispensationalist, takes it as referring to a literal thing, pertaining to Palestine, pertaining to the nation, and so on. That land over there is special, and God is still going to do something with that land, set up a temple, a throne, sacrifices again, and so on over there. Another is the restoration of Israel. And Amos chapter 9, again, it's taken as a literal promise for the literal Jews, whereas in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council, James, in order to justify what was going on, that is the gospel going out to the Jews, the Gentiles being brought in as well, he refers back to that Amos 9 prophecy and says, look, this is what the prophet was talking about. The gospel going out to the Jews first and the Gentiles also being brought in. Another error is that it downgrades the church. They teach that the church was merely a parenthesis, and that the main thing was with the Jews. Whereas Ephesians 3:11 says, for example, that it speaks of the church as being God's eternal purpose. And finally, it teaches that God has two bodies, Israel and the church, whereas John 16, for example, Romans 11, Galatians 3, they're neither Jew nor Greek, but one, all one in Christ. And that God is bringing, God has one body, the elect, from every nation, from every generation. Now, what is covenant theology? It was brought to America by the Puritans, characteristically a Presbyterian view. For example, Charles Hodge, Louis Berkhoff, his systematic theology. And the idea is that the history of redemption has to do with three covenants, which boil down, some say there's just two. Some say there's three. That is the covenant of redemption, established in eternity between the Father and the Son. Then the covenant of works between God and Abraham, and then the covenant of grace between God and the elect sinner. Some combine the covenant of redemption and the covenant of grace and make it only two, another grace and works. But in it all, they teach that God has always had one covenant, one agreement, one arrangement, one way of salvation for the sinner. And there's truth in that. I mean, I mean, salvation has always been only by grace. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, Genesis 6. But the error of it is that it emphasizes the idea of just one covenant too much. It emphasizes the one covenant thing too much and does not make an adequate distinction between the old and new covenant. They even, as John Zenz points out in one article that is very helpful to me, he points out how there's a lot of those covenant theologians refer to Ephesians 2:12 as singular, whereas it is plural. You know, the strangers to the covenants of promise, they say strangers to the covenant of promise. You know, they're so imbibed, so thinking in terms of this one covenant, one purpose, one plan of God through the Old Testament and through the New, that they even interpret Ephesians 2:12 singular. The Bible, and another question is where does the Bible speak of a pre-creation covenant of redemption? I've heard that phrase through different preachers, in eternity, and the covenants and the councils of redemption. There may have been councils of redemption, but where do you see a covenant of redemption before creation? It fails to acknowledge then a new economy, a new covenant. That is to say, it fosters a continuation of the theocracy, the old covenant. As I pointed out before, the key to understanding this, I believe, is making a distinction between the soteriological aspect and the historical aspect. Soteriologically, yes, God has always saved people only one way. The Old Testament saints, they were saved by faith in the coming Messiah, just like we're saved by faith in the Messiah who came. Romans 6, he's saying, look back at Abraham before the law. Look at David under the law. Both of them were saved by faith, just like we are. But historically, economically, dispensationally, the old is gone, and there is a new covenant. What are examples of the errors and the outworkings of those errors? Here's some. That the Ten Commandments are the primary rule of obedience, they would teach. There's, for example, here in the Westminster Confession, Presbyterian, question number 97, what special use is there of the moral law to the regenerate? It ends up saying that they should take the greater care to conform themselves to the law as the rule of their obedience. So they teach that the Ten Commandments are the Christian's primary rule of conduct. Another is a tendency towards religious buildings, because they do not make an adequate break between the old and the new. Therefore, they tend to bring along with them too much from the old, where you've got religious buildings, religious days, religious garments, and religious days. I mean, the tendency is very strong in Presbyterianism to call the Lord's Day the Sabbath. Where do they get it? It's from the Old Testament. I mean, you see very little of Sabbath terminology in the New Testament. The main thing you see of it in the New Testament is forbearance for those who esteem one day above the other. Don't let anybody judge you with regard to Sabbath. A religious nation, again, bringing that theocracy idea, importing it into the new covenant. You see that in Reconstructionism, hoping to make America a holy nation by politics. I wish I could have found that quote of Cotton Mather. The Quakers were coming to America. He was trying to round up support to not let them off the ship, but rather reroute them, sell them off like slaves, treat them like, get them off to the Caribbeans or somebody. We don't want these heathen Quakers to come onto our land. This is a holy nation. Let's keep it a holy nation, that idea. And another example is the burning of heretics, stoning the heretic, like in the Old Testament. And also the idea that Christendom equals the church. In the Old Testament, under the theocracy, everybody is this physical people of God. All you had to do was be born into the Jewish nation. A physical birth qualified you to be a part of the people of God, so they transfer that into the New Testament. Churchgoers are the church. That is a thought there. Externalism, such as infant baptism being effectual in bringing the child into the covenant. Like John Windsor pointed out, if they don't, if we're going to be consistent, then we should not baptize girls. I mean, in the Old Testament, they didn't circumcise girls. Why then in the New Testament do we baptize girls? All right. What is the right view? I believe this last one is the New Covenant theology, which holds to the truths out of each one, but yet avoids the error of each. The idea is that all of God's historic process was moving toward Christ. And after Christ, history is comprehended by the New Covenant, which is the pivotal point in redemptive history. All other Old Testament covenants showed aspects of Christ's work. That is, the Davidic covenant, the Noahic covenant, Mosaic covenant, all those agreements, all those things were mainly pointing to Christ. The New Covenant fulfills all that was ever promised. The idea here is that the Old Covenant is replaced. And look at these scriptures. 2 Corinthians 3:11, for if that which fades away was with glory, how much more that which remains is in glory. Something has faded away. What is he talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 3? He was talking about the law. He was talking about the tablets of stone, the Ten Commandments. Hebrews 3:5 and 6, contrasting Moses, the mediator of the old, and Christ, the mediator of the new. A different head. Hebrews 8, when he says a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Hebrews 10 takes away the first that he may establish the second. Matthew 27, the veil was torn. Jeremiah 31, prophesying, not according to the covenant that I made with them. John 18, my kingdom is not of this world. Ephesians 2, the church is built upon what? The Ten Commandments? The law of Moses? No. The foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus being the chief cornerstone. In other words, the teaching of the apostles and the prophets. Ephesians 2:15, abolishing in his flesh the enmity. What do you mean? The law of commandments. In other words, the law was taken out of the way. The law was the division, point of distinction between Jews and Gentiles. And that law was taken out of the way and fulfilled in Christ. And so he says that's abolished. Matthew 16, I will build my church. Now that's something new, future, a brand new deal, you see. And so the ramifications, two things. Number one, the place, and number two, the people. What is the place of law in the new covenant? That maybe is one big issue. What is the place of law in the new covenant? Well, notice that the commandments on tables of stone, I'm referring to 2 Corinthians 3, verse 3, that it says it contrasts that with a law written on the heart. And so 2 Corinthians 3, here it is, going down through there, contrasting these two different covenants, two different administrations. And is it talking about the civil laws? Is it talking about the ceremonial laws? No. He's talking about the Ten Commandments specifically, a law written on the tables of stone. And he says that is in contrast with the law written on the heart. Two different things, that's abrogated. Not just the ceremonial aspect, not just the civil aspect, the political aspect. He's talking about the Ten Commandments being done away with there. And you see the difference going down through 2 Corinthians 3. We'll get there eventually, but you can look at it on your own. He's talking about two different mediators, Moses and Christ. The law of Moses and the law of Christ. The ministry of death, the ministry of life. The ministry of the letter, the ministry of the Spirit. The ministry of condemnation and of righteousness. Written on stone, written on hearts. Fading glory, abiding glory. And you see a difference brought out very well in Hebrews 8. A disobedient people and obedient people. Most didn't know the Lord back then. Now all in the new covenant know the Lord. The theocracy back then, that is the church equals the state, now it's a spiritual nation, not a political order. And notice this also, that Paul was formerly centered on the law of Moses. I think this is good. I mean, he brings this out different places. Galatians 1:14, he says, I excel beyond most of my countrymen in keeping the ancestral traditions. Paul was touching the law. He says, I'm blameless. But now we find Paul, as a Christian, he's centered on the mediator of the new covenant. To live is Christ. I mean, he wasn't thinking in terms of precepts. He was thinking in terms of a person. Romans 7:6, Spirit-led. But now we have been released from the law so that we serve in newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. And he speaks of himself as being a minister of the new covenant in 2 Corinthians 3:6. Another thing is that the new covenant subjects are under the law of Christ. You find this in the New Testament, Galatians 6:3, 1 Corinthians 9:20 and 21. It speaks of being under the law of Christ, not under the law of Moses. Bear one another's burdens and thus fulfill not the Ten Commandments, but the law of Christ. And it's interesting, in 1 Corinthians 9:20, we have these three positions brought out by these three words. In the Greek, it actually is right there in the Greek. The one word referring to the Jews means under law, whereas the word referring to the Gentiles is outside of law. But the word referring to the Christians is in law. We're in laud, married to Christ. It's a different concept, like the bride to the bridegroom. And it's a personal relationship. You're not trying to keep some precepts, but you have entered into a personal relationship with Christ, in law to him. A new covenant, a better covenant with new laws. We're talking about what is the place of law in the new covenant. What is the standard or the law for the New Testament? It's as I have loved you. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you. There's the main law for the new covenant, is love as I have loved you. That's how you're to operate. Or it's phrases like, in the Lord. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And wives, be subject to your husbands as fitting in the Lord. In other words, in the fear of the Lord, under the Lord, in view of the Lord, in the sight of the Lord, according to the will of the Lord. It's all, again, centered on what pleases the Lord. Well, even the Lord's Day, uh, how do we think of that? I mean, why do we come here today? Isn't the main reason you're here is not because of some precept so much as really because you want to be here. You're here because you love the Lord, because you love the people of God. That's the main reason that we have gathered here today, isn't it? Does anything still apply from the Old Testament? How are we to use the Old Testament? Well, it is Christocentric, not, as they say, nomocentric, not law-centered. Notice how the Lord in Luke 24, the 2 on the road to Emmaus, and then the 11 as they were gathered together, he referred to the Old Testament scriptures, and in them he brought out the things pertaining to himself. That's how the Old Testament was used by the Lord. And in John 5, the scriptures, and Moses, he wrote of me. Also, so it's Christ-centered. Also, it's spiritualized. For example, in 1 Timothy 5:18, referring to the support of the pastor, he goes back and borrows from the Old Testament precept about not muzzling the ox. And he says that applied, there's a principle there, and it applies to supporting the pastor. Also, it's intensified, like Matthew 5:28. Over and over you find that phrase, but I say unto you. He said, you heard it was said, you should not commit adultery, but I say to you, it goes deeper than that. It goes to dealing with victory over lust in the heart. So it was intensified. It is, obey your parents in the Lord, but then he goes on, this is the first commandment with promise. Honor your father and your mother. So Paul did, in the New Testament, quote from the Ten Commandments and use it. But notice in the Jerusalem Council, in Acts 15, see, the covenant theologians, they say, oh, yes, the ceremonial aspect is gone, the civil aspect is gone, but the moral is still there. The moral law is still primary rule for our obedience. But what did the Jerusalem Council say? It was in the context, remember, the issue was salvation, and whether or not they needed to keep the law of Moses and be circumcised. They sent that letter out to the Gentiles, and they didn't say anything about keeping the law. They didn't say anything about keeping the Ten Commandments. They said just those few things: abstain from fornication, strangle, blood, and so on, idols, and beyond this, no greater burden. You do this, you do well. They didn't lay any Ten Commandments on them at all, on those Gentiles. And another ninth point here. Note the order that Paul gives in Galatians 3. He referred back to the promise given to Abraham. He says the law doesn't nullify that promise. That promise to Abraham. He says, in other words, the law was just an interruption, a break, a parenthesis. Now Christ has come. He's the fulfillment of all that was being promised back there. Notice also in Romans 13, Paul does not exhort the Christians to expend energy to see the Mosaic law implemented in the Roman state. In other words, not Reconstructionism, not theonomy, but rather he exhorts them to submit to the government. He does not tell the people, the Christians, to try to subdue it with a Mosaic code. And, I was just thinking of this. Think of the difference now between trying to get laws in the land, anti-porn laws in the land. The difference between that as opposed to seeing historic revival come, where society is changed from the inside out, and the taverns go dry, and the porn shops dry up. I mean, it's because of the new covenant entering the heart of the individuals. And, it's internal. It comes from internal reality rather than an external law forbidding this, forbidding that. And that's not to say, I don't think that is to say that we wouldn't do well to have as many righteous laws as we can. But where do you draw the line, in it all? I don't know. I think the main thing is that we're to concentrate on preaching the gospel and seeing the power of God come on the scene, whereby our society is changed that way. The people in the new covenant. Each covenant defines its subjects. The Noahic covenant, it was all creation. The Abrahamic covenant was him and his Isaac, their children. Mosaic, the nation of Israel. Davidic, David and his lineage through Solomon. The new covenant is those who know the Lord. In contrast, well, I'll mention that later. So each defines its requirements for membership. You see, in the old covenant, it was physical birth. That's all you had to do to get in to be one of God's people, was be born a Jew. That's all you had to do to be circumcised. But the new covenant is spiritual birth. That is, like John chapter 1, verse 13, those who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but born of God. A spiritual birth. That's how you get in the new covenant. In contrast, here in Burkhoff's systematic theology, you've got this statement: children of believers enter the covenant by birth. He says that. You enter the covenant by birth. Westminster Confession, section 24, verse 2, one of the purposes of childbearing in marriage is for the increase of the church with an holy seed. And that's taught not only in Presbyterian circles, but even in Baptist circles. That in other words, we Christian parents should have children, to even have as many children as we can to overtake the world with a holy seed. The more children they have, the more Christians will have. Therefore, it'll conquer the world. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church, for baptism of an infant, it says he's born in sin, he's condemned by birth. All right, that's true. But out of the other side of their mouth, they say that they're holy in Christ, and as members of his church, they ought to be baptized. That infant, I guess they hang a whole lot on 1 Corinthians 7, about the children of the believing parent being holy. So I can understand why John Windsor ended off his sermon pointing everyone to Christ. I mean, that's it. Philippians 1:21, for me to live is Christ. Paul was so much devoted to Christ, so much in allegiance to Christ, so much in conformity to Christ, that he said, for me to live is Christ. And he's it. You see, maybe there's some questions. I wouldn't doubt that there would be.
It's too much of an oversimplification to say that the basic difference between covenant theology and new covenant theology is where you say, what's the child that do what thing the fulfill the thing to believe.
I think, that's part of it for sure. I think the main thing is, it's like in that diagram there, covenant theology does not make an adequate distinction between the old and the new. See, like for example, I was talking with Tom Wigton, some of you know him, and he would hold to the Presbyterian, Puritan, covenant theology view. And I was emphasizing the distinction between the old and the new covenants. And he says, you're dispensational. I said, no, I'm not. I said, I speak against it myself. But see, in his mind, that's to make a break there. Well, you're dispensational. And so New Covenant theology is saying that in contrast to covenant theology, we're saying, no, it's not just the civil laws and the ceremonial laws that are abrogated now, but it's actually the whole ball of wax is gone. So all of the law of Moses is abrogated. And as a covenant, it's all gone. If there's a definite break, we're now under a new law, under a new head, a new mediator, a whole new system. It's not just been modified. Not a modified covenant. It's a brand new covenant with new laws. And what applies from the old, what applies from the law of Moses, is almost incidental. Like I say, we know that we can still go back there and use everything in the Old Testament. But as I say, it's been intensified, it's been spiritualized, and Paul does use it in the New Testament. But the thrust is the law of Christ, the law of Christ. Christ.
I see that in Romans chapter 3. Saying a fulfillment of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, will come together when we agree that with all pointing to Christ, who is all by faith, that Abraham before the law ever existed was saved by faith, as we keep God righteous and righteousness. And then Christ's fulfillment of that piece, the practice is obsolete. Right? These the physical actions and traditions are obsolete because they're fulfilled. Right?
Yeah. In the covenantal sense, it's total. A total break. You see that brought out so clearly in 2 Corinthians 3. Because as I say, there he's talking very clearly about those tablets of stone, the 10 Commandments. He's not talking about ceremonies. He's not talking about civil aspect. He's talking about the 10 Commandments. A total break in the covenantal aspect. And so that we're under a new covenant, new laws, new principles. But we know that nevertheless we must admit there are moral principles that we can glean from the Old Testament. And also pictures of Christ and that we can glean from the Old Testament, like the Lord did when he preached to opened the Scriptures.
I think that I understand it, that maybe there may be some that would misunderstand the fact that when you're talking about the law, the 10 Commandments, you're not saying that it's okay to, commit murder, or it's not okay, but it's more intensified than I think you can, because it might be someone or younger that might be.
Good point. Yeah. So, is when we're saying we're no longer under the law of Moses, are we saying that it's all right to murder, for example? Well, what does the Lord teach on it? He says, look, not only murder, but even inward murder, hatred. So it goes deeper than even what the 10 Commandments. The Lord's teaching goes deeper, requires more, and also produces more. It gives victory over not only murder, but inward murder, which is hatred, bitterness, jealousy,